Right. So I have really kept my title close to what you asked, case studies or comparative research, a plea for greater engagement with comparisons. Now, I will try and keep myself to 25 minutes. I'll also try not to speed up if I find I'm running out of time, and ask you to bear with me. But I've really taken this keynote as an opportunity for me to mull over with you how I became, what I'm going to say, an advocate for comparative research. And I'm going to take as my starting point my belief that anthropology, social anthropology, my discipline, is intrinsically comparative. So I will give you the example of a very well-known American anthropologist, Margaret Mead, who for 50 years, I think, basically monopolized popular anthropology in the United States, starting with her first study of child rearing in Samoa. That was her actual PhD research. Then it became a book called Growing Up in Samoa. But what that study was about, was trying to understand how culture, as a cultural determinist, creates forms of behavior. And she was looking for an understanding of why American, and the term is very new at the time, teenagers behaved as they did. So that was her base. And she went to Samoa to compare. Basically, you know, the anthropologist has to compare with something. They don't come out with a blank slate. And so I think intuitively my discipline is comparative, even when they're doing case studies, so to speak. But I'm going to talk to you really about my progress of how I moved from my first big comparative study of refugees starting from 1999 to 2002 with Palestinian youth, and then moving on to Sahrawi and Afghan youth, and then looking at displaced Syrians first in the neighboring countries, and then, as Frank has mentioned, which was not my own research, but I brought research together to look at the way that displaced Syrians were being perceived and were perceiving themselves in a number of different countries. And I see that Anne is here. She did a very interesting study of Syrians in Jordan. I'll talk more about the Lebanon and Turkey, but there were also other similar studies. My focus in these comparative studies was really originally what happens to older children, to what happens to their lives when they and their families are uprooted and forced to move. So of course we had certain ideas, which we would call low-level hypotheses at this time, that there would be there would be alterations to individual rites of passage. There would be changes in formal, non-formal, informal education, access to labor markets, and so on. So we had a number of hypotheses. None of them were really what actually emerged as the main concerns. Let me see if I can progress this. Yes, I did. Okay, so this is the overview. I'm just going to go over very briefly some definitions, and again, talk a little bit more about ethnography as implicitly comparative. And then the way I moved into broader comparative work was by the challenge of sui generis. These were findings from our Palestinian study that were not accepted by policymakers and practitioners, and that drew us into extending our study. Then I'll talk about the displaced Syrians, and I'll stop with maybe a plea for comparative research in developing our understanding of human behavior. So I'm just going to say that generalizations, which of course quantitative researchers don't like this, but in qualitative research, we're looking for generalizations. Sometimes they screen out individual differences and idiosyncrasies, but I take the position that generalization is at the core of the anthropological project, particularly of cross-cultural and cross-societal comparison, and that the social sciences are the study of meaningful human behavior. So in the context of our workshop today, meaningful human behavior in the context of forced migration and refugee studies comes from comparative research, which seeks generalizations, but also remains aware of differences. So in case there's any concern over what a case study is, I see it as an in-depth, intensive research on a specific group, a community, or society, and then comparative research is as a methodology that aims to make comparisons across different case studies. Now, sometimes the case studies are in languages or historical projects. I think that's where we see most comparative studies, sometimes of countries and cultures, but we really haven't seen that many comparative studies in forced migration and refugee studies. I think there's an implicit assumption again that we as scholars interested in forced migration and refugee studies are not confined to the ivory tower, but we actually aspire to make a difference in the real world, the world of humanitarian assistance and development aid. Yet comparative research in forced migration in general remains very limited. Maybe we'll discuss that more tomorrow when we are in our roundtable. And certainly with youth is still scarcely examined. I put some of that down to perhaps the difficulties of getting ethical approval to work with individuals under the age of 18, but that wasn't always the case. So I would ask the question why this is the case, and I don't really have an answer. I just would like to encourage that despite these methodological challenges, we have really important lessons that can be learned from comparative research in forced migration. Now, I will tell you how I got, I'm going to say, drawn into broader comparison rather than just my own culture and society and that which I'm studying. In 1998, I was approached by the Andrew Mellon Foundation to do a case study of children in Gaza. There had been a lot of psychosocial studies, and it seemed that they wanted another one. And when I was asked to do that, I actually said, no, there's no point in another case study of children in Gaza. What would be the purpose? And in addition, I had some problems with the definitions that were being presented. They wanted a case study of adolescence, which again is a Western term, perhaps developed from the work of the developmental psychologist Piaget, coming from very middle class contexts. So I pushed back and suggested, what we could do would be a 5-case study. Let's do a case study of Palestinian. We'll use the term adolescence for now, and later on we change that to youth, across the 5 UNRWA, the 5 sites where the UN Organization for Palestine Refugees operates: Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, the West Bank, and Gaza. And that was approved, and we began our study, which I thought gave us some very, very interesting findings. And at the end of that period, we wanted to present these findings to the big organizations that work with youth. We were in New York. We were presenting our findings to UNICEF. I can say that now. And we were astonished to find that the panel at UNICEF pretty much dismissed our findings. They said this is just anecdotal. And anyway, as it's Palestinian, it's sui generis. What they wanted was quantitative survey data analyzed comparatively, and what we were presenting, they found couldn't be taken, it couldn't be generalizable, therefore it couldn't influence policy or practice. It was, as I said, sui generis, meaning of its own kind, peculiar to itself. And fortunately, the Andrew Mellon Foundation was very much on our side, and they agreed then for us to extend the study for another 3 years and to look at the case across the whole breadth of the Middle East, extending it to Sahrawi youth in Algeria and Afghan youth in Iran. So by extending our research this way, we hoped that we would be able to contribute to an alternative approach, portrayal and analysis of how young people make sense of and cope with prolonged forced migration. In all cases, amongst the Palestinians and the Sahrawi and the Afghan, our researchers in each of these field sites were, in the Palestinian case, they were all Palestinian academics, some of them refugees, some of them from the West Bank not. But certainly we thought now we're going to be able to come to a study where our comparisons will be recognized as being generalizable. So we worked in the Tandouf camps amongst the Sahrawi. There was some involvement with UNHCR. A number of Italian and Spanish NGOs were involved. And then in Lebanon, as I said earlier, in the West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. And then in Iran, we worked with Afghan youth in Mashhad and in Tehran. So, was generalization possible across the entire Middle East region? We think that there were different contexts, but there were similar characteristics. The population was mainly Muslim, Sunni, and Shia. They had largely been exposed to very prolonged forced migration, and mobility was a part of the cultural history. So, as I had suggested previously, this ethnographic and participatory research method was particularly useful for the study of youth, particularly as it allowed us to approach youth in such a way that they could set their own agendas, their own questions, and their own expected outcomes. So we were able then to draw on methods, draw on activities such as sports, art, poetry, prose, photography, music, to produce the anthropological data in a way that would be more meaningful than conventional experimental survey approaches. However, participation and participatory research doesn't happen in a social and political vacuum. So obviously there were differences that emerged. I'll just go over those really quickly. So amongst our Palestinian youth, although we had proposed they could do art projects, they could do photography projects, whatever it is that they wanted, they chose to have a voice by producing a weekly newsletter. And I'll come back to that. This is how they felt they were expressing their agency, putting forward what concerned them about their current conditions. And also, it was a way of creating a sense of inclusion amongst these youth. So in all of our studies, we use semi-structured interviewing with 50 households. Our households had to have young people between the ages of 8 and 18. And we found that often we would start by entry into the schools through the Macmillan-Urey questionnaire, which is a very, very Western questionnaire and one which really puzzled those using that particular study. I can go back to that. In the end, we had about 250 qualitative interviews, which we entered into en vivo. And we interviewed youth and their caregivers. And of course, there was a lot of participant observation notes that were uploaded to en vivo. In all of our cases, our team leader for the Sahrawi case study was again a Palestinian with a Canadian travel document, who was able to use her Palestinian identity to initiate a lot of discussion about identity and national struggle with Sahrawi youth. And in the Afghan case, the team leader was an Iranian with a Canadian travel document who had already carried out a great deal of research with Afghan refugees in Iran. And in Iran, there was a bit of a cat and mouse game where the informal schools were constantly being shut down by the Iranian government, and then new ones being opened, and the young people actively engaged in decorating the new buildings and getting a school moving. Now, if I go back to the Sahrawi case for a minute, again, this was the kind of schoolroom that they had. The children and the young people had a great deal of spare time and were really very interested in the activities that we were setting out for them. They also engaged in the creation of newsletters, the poetry contests, and so on, in order to engage with us. And with the Afghan young people, it was again the same. This was the informal school setting for the Afghan young people. Some of the key findings that emerged, I'm just going to go over that amongst with all of these 5 different groups, was this multiple contested identities of young people who were all second or third generation forced migrants. It was something that we called a kind of heteroglossia. There were contradictory narratives. There was a multivocality of popular memory. In the Sahrawi, of course, the camps were the homeland, but these young people had to spend a great deal of time away, either in Cuba or in Spain. And this was reflected in their sense of identity. The same was true with Afghan youth who were very interested in learning more about Afghanistan. One of the reasons that they wanted us to support their newsletter is they wanted to do research to find out more about who their parents were, what it was like back at home, because they had no notion of what it was like at home. In all three cases, we found that the schools really instilled a very deep sense of identity and promoted a notion of national history. And where it was weak, a lot of the projects that they wanted us to commit to tried to develop that national history. And there was a commitment to help family, which was very gendered in all of these cases, in and out of the home. And there were also gendered preferences in terms of schooling. But amongst all these groups, the resilience and optimism of youth was very, very clear. And I think had it not been for that kind of comparative research, we wouldn't have been able to promote these findings as generalizations that you could make about refugee youth in prolonged forced migration. I then found myself, as the Syrian crisis grew, actually becoming interested in comparative study for a different reason, not so much to look for generalizations, but to look for differences, because what I could see was happening, particularly in 2012, 2013, was that really very little was known about Syria or the diversity of this multicultural, plural, ethno-religious society. But a template was being adopted by UNHCR that had been developed in Africa and Southeast Asia, and it was being applied in the region without really recognition of the differences that there were amongst displaced Syrians. So there was a UNHCR refugee camp model that was being applied, and I could see clearly it was rejected by Turkey and by Lebanon, and only one UNHCR camp was actually built in Jordan. Eventually there were two and then a few others. So here I thought that actually a comparative study of the different perceptions and aspirations of displaced Syrians across the three neighboring countries, across Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, would be important to lay bare the differences in perceptions and aspirations of displaced Syrians, but also practitioners in each of these countries. And now this map, those of you who've worked with refugees, you've probably seen many, many times. I chose to look at the November 2017 issue. And what I want to show in this map is really the density of temporary settlement at Syria's frontiers basically reflects the diversity and complexity of Syria's population. So the Syrian population didn't have to move across these three different borders, but because of any particular armed conflict making it difficult to move in any other way that they wanted to, but rather because those who fled to Lebanon, about 1 million fled to Lebanon, as you can see in this map, were mainly Syrians who had already worked in Lebanon before. They were, I'm going to use the word welcomed, which might have been the case in the first year. Later on, it was perhaps tolerated as temporary workers, not as refugees. But prior to the crisis emerging, Lebanon regularly had about 500,000 Syrians working in agriculture and construction in the country. So this was really more a case of Syrians who were already had the links, they had kinship links, they had economic links with Lebanon, and they brought their families with them. And this is beside the point that, of course, Lebanon, as with Jordan, was part of Greater Syria just 100 years ago at the close of World War I. Jordan is the same case. You can see that most displaced Syrians remained in the northern part of Jordan, where they were treated as temporary guests. Most Syrians in Jordan were from the neighboring rural communities of Daraa and the Hauran. They had very close tribal ties and kinship networks that preceded the crisis. Many of them had already been moving back and forth for employment at one point or another, and very few were willing to actually enter the camp set up by UNHCR. Perhaps 10% were in the UNHCR. But they were temporary guests and not permitted to work until after 2017, the Jordan Compact came into effect, but we can talk about that later. Situation in Turkey, again, this very, very broad span of displaced Syrians along the southern border. In some places, towns like Kilis, 60% of the population was Syrian, but you also, again, have to keep in mind that that border was very fluid. And in fact, before the end of World War I, that whole border region that you're looking at was part of the Aleppo province, which was of Greater Syria, and that also to the west, the western side of the Syrian Arab Republic, that was the Hatay province, which was only given to Turkey in 1938. Turkey again welcomed or accepted Syrians at the very beginning. Now, of course, the numbers are close to 4 million, but the first 250,000 who arrived in Turkey, Turkey set up what I'm going to call as temporary towns, rather than accept the UNHCR to build towns. And it also created domestic asylum law to deal not with refugee Syrians, but with displaced Syrians. There are a lot of reasons for this. But basically it recognized them as displaced. It also has considered giving citizenship to some. We don't really know the numbers who are there, but also gave them the right to work and access to health and education. And in the last couple of years has been shutting down refugee camps because it's been promoting self-settlement. So it's very different population, very different response from that in Jordan and in Lebanon. And then, as Frank mentioned, the recent issue of the Journal of Refugee Studies presents, I believe it's 8 case studies of displaced Syrians in Sweden, in France, in Germany, along the Balkans, in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, and also in the Emirates. And so you really have a sense. They aren't comparative in the same sense as the study I just talked to you about, but it gives you a series of case studies from which one might be able to draw out some generalizations. So let me move on. I'm coming close to the end of my time. So some of the key findings, I think, from having this sort of trans-regional comparative study was, again, a sense that history and historical context matters in understanding where Syrians seek sanctuary and how they are accepted, how social cohesion comes about or doesn't, and also the same with social inclusion. That horizontal ties, meaning kinship ties, economic ties, social ties, account for the growing levels of civil society generosity at local and national levels. And this is particularly pronounced in Lebanon, where there's very little government interaction, and that in almost all the cases, displaced Syrians have preferred to be recognized as guest workers or just as guests, rather than becoming refugees and engaging in onward migration, despite the difficult conditions. Of course, 1 million Syrians moved into Europe in 2015, 2016. There are very special reasons for that, but I wouldn't say that it's because of the EU-Turkey agreement that those numbers dropped. There are many different reasons for that. So in doing a comparative study in this case, I was seeking to bring to the fore an understanding of why the different governments and hosts responded as they did, and where displaced Syrians' perceptions, aspirations, and behaviors were at times, and in some contexts, similar, but at other times they differed across the transnational field. So to conclude, I think I'm still within my 30 minutes. I just argue that comparative studies can discover generalizable responses to challenging circumstances, but comparative studies may also lay bare significant differences in historical, local contexts, and responses. And overall, I would say that comparative studies can greatly improve outcomes in forced migration and post-conflict transitions and solutions.